On August 7, 2024, at exactly 6:47 in the evening, the state of Texas carried out the execution of Arthur Lee Burton by lethal injection inside the Huntsville unit. He was 54 years old. He had spent 26 years on death row. As the drugs began to flow, Burton looked straight ahead and delivered his final statement, words that would appear in headlines across the country the very next day. He said, "To all the people I have hurt and caused pain, I wish we didn't have to be here at this moment, but I want you to know that I am sorry for putting y'all through this and my family." He thanked those who had supported him, those who prayed for him, even the ones he never met. Then he added 3 simple words that still echo, "Bird is going home." And with that, Arthur Lee Burton was gone. But rewind nearly 27 years. On a warm summer evening in Houston, July 29, 1997, a 48-year-old mother of 3 named Nancy Adleman stepped out her front door for her usual jog along the trail near the bayou. She wore her running shoes, tied tight. She waved goodbye to her family. She never came back through that door. What happened next on that quiet trail turned into a nightmare, an abduction, a brutal attack, a struggle, and finally, death, strangled with the very shoelaces from her own shoes. The man responsible, Arthur Lee Burton, confessed to police that she looked at him during those final moments and said, "God forgives you and I do, too." He later denied it all at trial. The case dragged through confessions, retractions, appeals, claims of intellectual disability, courtroom fights that reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court, twice. For 26 years, Nancy Adleman's family waited while the legal system ground on. Until that Tuesday evening in August 2024, when the long road ended in a small room at Huntsville, with Burton strapped to the gurney, making his last apology before the state ended his life. This is the full story, from the night a routine jog became a murder that shocked Houston, through the investigation that caught him, the confession that cracked open the truth, the decades of appeals, and finally, the execution chamber where one chapter closed forever. This is Bruised Voice, where the truth leaves scars. If this opening already has your heart racing and you want every detail of how a single evening jog ended in 27 years of justice, and final words that made national news, then stay right here. Smash that like button if you're locked in, subscribe to Bruised Voice right now so you never miss when we drop the next heavy case, and turn on all post notifications. Drop a comment below, do final words like these change how you see a case? And tell me what country you're watching from, we're building this community one story at a time. Let's go deeper. Let's go back to the beginning. It was July 29, 1997. Houston, Texas. A Tuesday evening, warm and humid the way Texas summers always are. Nancy Adleman, a 48-year-old mother of 3, laced up her sneakers and stepped out of her front door for her evening jog, something she did regularly, a routine that had never given her or her family any reason for concern. She waved to her husband Mark and called out that she would be back in about an hour, the same thing she had said dozens of times before. The kids were inside finishing up their evening routines. Her daughter Sarah, who was 16 at the time, remembers her mom promising to help with homework when she returned. Her sons were already planning the next family outing. Everything felt ordinary. Everything felt safe. Nancy never came home. As the minutes stretched into hours that night, the house grew quieter. Mark started checking the clock more often. Sarah kept glancing toward the front door every time a car passed outside. The boys asked where Mom was. Phone calls to friends and neighbors began. No one had seen her. By late evening the worry had turned into something heavier. Mark picked up the phone and reported his wife missing. Police in Northwest Houston took the report and started asking questions about her usual route. They learned she liked to run along the trails near Brays Bayou, a spot many locals used for exercise because it offered shade and a peaceful stretch away from the busy streets. Officers noted the details and promised to keep an eye out. But no one expected what would come next. The following day, search teams moved through the area. They walked the paths Nancy had taken so many times. They called her name. They looked for any sign. Then, in a wooded section along the bayou, not far from the main trail, they found her. Her body was concealed in the brush, pulled off the path and left in a spot that made it hard to spot from the jogging route. The scene told its own story right away. Her shorts and underwear had been forcibly removed and left near the body. Bruising covered parts of her arms and legs, clear signs of a violent physical struggle that had lasted long enough for her to fight back. A medical examination later confirmed the cause of death. Nancy Adleman had been strangled to death with her own shoelace, the very one from the sneakers she had tied so carefully before leaving the house. But Nancy Adleman was never just a name in a case file or a headline about a jogger who did not return. She was a woman who had built a full life out of words and family and quiet determination. She grew up as the eldest of 3 children in East Baton Rouge, Louisiana. From the time she was 11 years old she had been filling notebooks with poetry, lines that captured the world around her in ways that made people stop and listen. That early love for writing stayed with her through every chapter of her life. She went on to earn a degree in theater from Louisiana State University, where she threw herself into every production and every script she could find. After that she headed north to the University of Minnesota and completed a Master of Fine Arts, sharpening the skills that would shape the rest of her career. In the late 1970s she made the move to Houston. The city was growing fast back then, full of energy and opportunity for artists who wanted to create. Nancy settled in Northwest Houston and started building the kind of life she had always pictured. She worked as a playwright, turning her poems and ideas into stories that were performed on local stages. She balanced late-night writing sessions with the demands of raising 3 children. Her husband Mark stood beside her through every deadline and every school event. Together they created a home where creativity was encouraged and family came first. The 2 sons and their daughter Sarah grew up hearing their mother read her latest lines out loud at the dinner table, watching her rehearse scenes in the living room, and knowing that no matter how busy her writing schedule became, she always made time for them. Nancy kept that same steady rhythm into her 40s. By 1997 her children were older and more independent, which gave her a little extra room to focus on new projects while still holding the family together. The evening jogs became part of her routine, a way to clear her head after a day of writing and to stay active in the Texas heat. She knew those trails well. She had run them for years without any trouble. Neighbors would sometimes wave as she passed. Other runners exchanged quick nods. It was the kind of place where people felt they belonged. Yet on that Tuesday everything changed the moment she stepped onto the path. The family waited through the evening, then through the night. Mark drove the route himself looking for any sign of her. Sarah sat by the phone hoping for good news. The boys stayed close, sensing the tension in the house. When the police finally brought the update the next day, the news hit like a weight none of them could lift. The woman who had filled their home with stories and laughter was gone. The playwright who had started writing at 11 years old would never finish her next piece. The mother who had raised 3 children with patience and heart would not see them graduate or build their own families. She had everything to live for until that Tuesday evening. Nancy left behind a husband who had shared every chapter with her, 2 sons who carried her creative spark, and a daughter who was just beginning to understand the strength her mother had shown every single day. The city of Houston in 1997 felt a little quieter after that discovery along the bayou. People who had never met Nancy started locking their doors earlier and watching their routines a little closer. Runners who used those same trails looked over their shoulders for weeks afterward. The case moved quickly from a missing person report to a full investigation because the evidence at the scene left no doubt that this had been a targeted attack. The police now had a crime scene. They had a victim. They had the heartbreaking statements from a family that would never be the same. What they did not have yet was the person responsible. But the trail of clues was already forming, and the man whose name would soon be tied to this case forever was about to step into the spotlight in a way no one in Houston could have predicted. The story of Nancy Adleman did not end on that wooded path. It continued through every question her family asked, every memory they held onto, and every step the investigators took to find answers. And those answers would take years to fully surface, years that tested the limits of patience and justice in ways that still echo today. If her story has already pulled you in and you want to hear exactly how the investigation unfolded from the very first tip to the moment the truth came out, stay with me. We are just getting started. But to understand how this case unfolded, you first need to understand who Arthur Lee Burton was before that July evening in 1997 changed everything. Arthur Lee Burton was born on March 29, 1970, in Bastrop, Louisiana, though he spent most of his life in Houston, Texas. He came into the world in a home that offered little stability. His father was absent for long stretches, never really part of the picture, and the family struggled hard just to get by. There was at least one brother, Michael, and together they faced periods when the lights went out because the electricity bill could not be paid. Food ran short sometimes. Welfare helped when it could, but the children knew hunger and uncertainty far too well for their young ages. Growing up in those conditions left marks that would show up later in different ways. By his teenage years, the path had already started to turn. Michael Burton would later testify in court that his brother began using marijuana at age 16. Just a year later, at 17, he got involved in cocaine trafficking. The money might have seemed like a quick way out of the hardship, but it pulled him deeper into trouble. Then came the burglaries. Court records show that at age 18, Burton committed 39 burglaries in a single month. He and his accomplices targeted homes and stole guns, radios, fishing equipment, calculators, anything they could turn into cash. It was a spree that caught the attention of law enforcement fast. Those early crimes built a record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Yet the man who emerged in his 20s looked different to the people closest to him. By July 1997, Arthur Lee Burton was 27 years old. He was married, in a common-law relationship with Felicia Batts, and they had built a family together. He had 3 biological children and 1 stepchild from her previous relationship. He worked as a cement finisher, a job that demanded long hours outdoors in the Texas heat, pouring foundations, smoothing concrete, building things that would last. His wife described him as hardworking and present. She said he treated her son like his own and made sure the kids had what they needed. His mother, Fanny Burton, spoke of how he loved to build things, perhaps a way of creating order where his own childhood had none. She pointed out that despite the absence of his father, he tried to be there for his own children in ways he had never experienced. Neighbors and co-workers saw a man who showed up every day, put in the work, and kept his head down. He lived in Harris County, in the same city where Nancy Adleman raised her family. On the surface, he appeared to have turned a corner from the troubled teen who ran burglaries and dealt drugs. He had responsibilities now, a wife who relied on him, for children who looked up to him, a job that paid the bills. People who knew him in those adult years often said he was a good father, a steady provider. No one reported seeing violence or abuse in the home. No red flags waved from the people who shared daily life with him. But those early years had left patterns that did not disappear. The thefts at 18 showed a willingness to take what was not his. The drug involvement at 17 pointed to choices made under pressure or for quick gain. The absent father and the unstable home meant he grew up without steady guidance. Court documents and family testimony painted a picture of a man who carried that past forward, even as he tried to build something better. His brother Michael described the childhood they shared: welfare, hunger, no father, but also said Arthur had become a hard worker who never showed violence at home. The contrast was real. One side of him worked cement and raised kids. The other side had once broken into homes and sold cocaine. In the months leading up to July 29, 1997, Burton lived what looked like an ordinary life in Houston. He went to work, came home to his family, handled the routines of fatherhood. No one in his circle reported anything out of place. No arguments that spilled into the street. No warnings from friends or relatives that something was off. Yet the crime that would soon tie his name to Nancy Adleman's would reveal a side that no one close to him had seen coming, or at least, had not spoken about publicly. The signs from his youth were there in the records: the burglaries, the drugs, the lack of structure early on. But by 27, he had a job, a family, a routine. People who loved him saw the man he had become, not the boy who had once stolen guns and dealt cocaine. They defended him as someone who had overcome a rough start. His wife and mother would stand by that description even after everything changed. So how does a man with a family and a steady job end up at the center of one of Houston's most talked about murder cases? What pushed him from cement finisher and father to the trail along Brays Bayou on that specific Tuesday evening? The answers would start to emerge in the days after Nancy Adleman failed to return from her jog. Investigators would look at his past record, question those who knew him, and piece together where he had been that night. But before any of that, before the confession, before the trial, Burton was just another resident of Houston going about his days. The gap between the troubled teenager and the family man raises questions that still linger. Did the early hardships shape choices he could never fully escape? Or had he truly changed, only for something to snap on that summer evening? His family would argue he was a good man caught in a terrible moment. The evidence at the scene and his own words to police would tell a different story. The truth would come out piece by piece, starting with a tip, a match to his description, and a conversation in an interrogation room that would change the course of multiple lives forever. But that part of the story is still ahead. For now, hold on to this image of Arthur Lee Burton in 1997, 27 years old, married with 4 children, working concrete under the Houston sun, carrying a childhood full of absence and hardship while trying to provide stability for his own kids. The man his family knew was real. The man the police would soon accuse was real too. And on July 29, those two versions collided in a way no one saw coming. If you're already wondering how a father and husband ends up accused of such a brutal crime, stay right here. The investigation is about to heat up, and the details that surface next will show exactly how close the answers were all along. And on the evening of July 29, his path crossed with Nancy Adleman's. Arthur Lee Burton had spent the day like so many others in the summer of 1997, working as a cement finisher under the Houston sun, handling the heavy labor that paid the bills for his wife and 4 children. By late afternoon he was off the job site, back in his neighborhood in Harris County, and he decided to take out his bicycle for a ride. It was something he did from time to time, a way to move through the city and catch the breeze along the water. He headed toward the trails near the bayou, the same stretches where local residents walked, jogged, and cleared their heads after a long day. The air was still thick with heat and humidity, the kind that made every breath feel heavier, but the paths offered shade from the trees and the sound of water running alongside. Burton rode at an easy pace at first, passing familiar spots, the kind of route he knew well enough that no one would think twice about seeing him there. Meanwhile, Nancy Adleman had left her front door just a short time earlier, sneakers laced, ready for the same kind of evening exercise she had done so many times before. She was moving at her steady jog, ponytail swinging, mind probably turning over the lines of her latest play or the plans she had for the kids later that week. The trail she chose took her along the bayou, the same general area where Burton was riding. At some point their routes brought them close enough that he noticed her running alone. No one else was around in that stretch at that exact moment. He threw down his bicycle, ran up behind her, and grabbed her before she could react. He forced her off the path and into the surrounding woods, away from any eyes that might pass by on the main trail. What happened next in those trees came out later in his own words to the police. He told them he tried to assault her. She fought back hard, screaming and resisting with everything she had. The struggle went on long enough that he grew nervous, he said, so nervous that he could not finish what he had started. At one point she looked at him and asked him why he was doing it, told him he did not have to do it. Those words stayed with him. He choked her first with his hands until she lost consciousness, then he took the lace from one of her own shoes and used it to strangle her completely. When it was over he left her body there in the brush, pulled far enough off the path that it would not be spotted right away, and he rode away. Back at the Adleman house the clock kept moving. Dinner came and went with no sign of Nancy. Mark checked the windows again and again. Sarah, their 16-year-old daughter, sat near the phone hoping it would ring with news that her mom had stopped somewhere or lost track of time. The two boys asked questions that grew quieter as the hours passed. The family started calling friends and neighbors, anyone who might have seen her on the trail. When darkness settled in and still nothing, Mark made the call no husband wants to make. He reported his wife missing. Police took the details, noted her usual jogging route along the bayou, and promised to look out for her. But the night stretched on with no answers. The next morning the search began in earnest. Officers and volunteers moved along the trails Nancy had run so often. They called her name into the trees. They checked every bend in the path. Then, in a wooded spot not far from the main route, they found her. The scene hit them immediately. Her body had been dragged into the brush and left concealed. Her clothing had been removed and dropped nearby. The marks on her told the story of a fight that had gone on for some time. The medical examiner would later confirm she had been strangled with her own shoelace. The city of Houston woke up to news of a woman taken right off a trail she had trusted for years. Runners who used the same path started looking over their shoulders. Neighbors locked doors earlier than usual. The Adleman family was left to face a loss that changed every single day after that. For 10 full days the investigation moved forward without a clear name attached to the crime. Detectives knocked on doors, reviewed any reports of suspicious activity near the bayou, and asked everyone in the area if they had seen anything out of place on July 29. Then a witness stepped forward with a detail that changed the direction of the case. This person had been outside near the Adleman home right around the time Nancy left for her jog. They noticed a man standing there on a bicycle. He looked agitated, the witness said. He gave off a mean expression when their eyes met. Not long after Nancy passed by on her way to the trail, the man rode off in the same direction. That description was enough to give investigators a starting point. They worked the lead hard, checking records, talking to people who knew the trails, and eventually the name Arthur Lee Burton came up. 10 days after the murder, On August 8, 1997, police brought the 27-year-old cement finisher in for questioning. Deputy Sheriff Benjamin Beal handled the interrogation. Burton sat across from him and gave his first account. He denied ever riding a bicycle along the bayou that evening. He denied any knowledge of Nancy Adleman. He denied any involvement in what had happened to her. He stuck to his story even as the questions kept coming. But the detectives had gathered more information by then. They had evidence that did not line up with the timeline Burton was giving. They pointed out the inconsistencies in his whereabouts and in the details he offered. The room grew tense as the gaps in his account became impossible to ignore. Burton's position started to shift. After hours of questioning and the weight of the contradictions, he changed his story completely. He gave a written confession. He told the officers he had been riding his bike along the bayou when he saw Nancy jogging. He admitted he grabbed her, dragged her into the woods, and tried to assault her. When she screamed and fought, he said he removed the lace from her shoe and used it to strangle her. He described how she had spoken to him in those final moments, asking why he was doing it and telling him he did not have to. Those words from her would be repeated in every courtroom argument and every appeal that followed for the next 26 years. With that confession on record, Arthur Lee Burton was placed under arrest for the murder of Nancy Adleman. The man who had left his family that evening for what seemed like an ordinary bike ride now sat in custody facing charges that would change every life connected to this case. His wife and mother would later speak in court about the hard-working father they knew, the man who had tried to build something better than the childhood he had endured. But the evidence and his own words had put him at the center of the crime scene along the bayou. Everything was in place for the legal battle that would follow. The investigation had delivered a suspect, a confession, and a clear picture of what happened on that trail. Then came the trial, the appeals, and the decades on death row that no one in Houston could have predicted would stretch all the way to 2024. The story of how one evening ride led to an arrest and a conviction that held firm for 27 years is about to unfold in full detail. Stay with me, because the courtroom fights and the final chapter are still ahead. Let's walk through every single minute of that Tuesday evening step by step so you can see exactly how an ordinary summer night turned into the crime that would send Arthur Lee Burton to death row for the next 27 years. Picture the timeline graphic filling the screen as we move forward in real time. July 29, 1997. Northwest Houston. The temperature still hovered in the high 80s even as the sun began to dip lower. Around 6:30 that evening, Nancy Adleman finished up a few things around the house. She changed into her running clothes, laced up her sneakers with care, and called out to her family that she was heading out for her usual jog. She told Mark she would be back in about an hour. Sarah, their 16-year-old daughter, was in the middle of homework and reminded her mom not to forget to help with a math problem when she returned. The two boys were playing in the living room. Everything felt completely normal. Nancy stepped outside, closed the front door behind her, and started walking toward the Bayou Trail near West Road and Beltway 8. She had run this route dozens of times before. It was familiar ground, shaded by trees, with the sound of water flowing alongside the path. She began jogging at her steady pace, ponytail swinging, breathing in the humid Texas air. At the same time, just a short distance away in his own neighborhood, Arthur Lee Burton had finished his workday as a cement finisher. He had put in the long hours outdoors, and now he decided to take out his bicycle for a ride. He left his home where his wife and 4 children waited, hopped on the bike, and headed in the direction of the same bayou trails. He rode at an easy pace at first, moving through the streets and eventually turning onto the paths that ran alongside the water. The trails were popular with locals, but at that hour on a Tuesday the area was quiet. No crowds. Just the occasional runner or walker. Burton kept pedaling, the wheels turning over the familiar ground, until his path brought him close to where Nancy was jogging. That is where the two lives crossed for the first and last time. As Nancy continued her route, focused on her run, Burton spotted her ahead on the trail. He threw his bicycle down on the side of the path. He ran up behind her without warning and grabbed her. Before she could scream or break free, he dragged her off the main trail and deep into the thick woods nearby. The trees closed around them. The sound of the bayou faded. Now they were out of sight from anyone who might pass by on the jogging path. The struggle began almost immediately. Nancy fought with everything she had. She screamed. She twisted and kicked. Bruises started forming on her arms and legs from the force of the attack. Burton tried to assault her. He pulled at her clothing. Her shorts and underwear were forcibly removed and tossed aside in the brush. But Nancy kept resisting. She kept screaming. The fight went on for several minutes, long enough that Burton later told police he grew worried someone would hear. Picture the timeline moving forward. The sun is setting lower. The shadows in the woods are getting deeper. Back at the Adleman house the minutes are ticking by. Mark glances at the clock. 7:30 comes and goes. Then 8 o'clock. Nancy is never late without calling. Sarah keeps looking toward the front door. The boys ask again where Mom is. The family starts making calls to friends. No one has seen her. The worry in the house grows heavier with every passing minute. Mark decides to drive the route himself, searching the streets and the edges of the bayou trail for any sign of his wife. The house feels emptier. The phone stays silent. Meanwhile, in those woods, the attack continued. Nancy was still fighting. She looked at Burton during the struggle and spoke words he would never forget. According to his own confession, she asked him why he was doing this and told him he did not have to. Those words hung in the air between them. But the resistance and the screaming made him panic. He put his hands around her throat and choked her until she lost consciousness. For a moment he thought it was over. He started to leave the area. But then he saw someone else walking nearby on the trail. Another person was close enough that they might discover what had happened. So Burton turned around. He went back to where Nancy lay. He took the lace from one of her own sneakers and used it to strangle her completely. The medical examiner would later confirm that was the final cause of death. He made sure the body would not be found right away. He pulled her farther into the brush and concealed her in a spot off the main path. Her clothing stayed scattered nearby. Then he left the scene. The timeline now shows the clock moving past 9 o'clock. Burton made his way back to his bicycle. He rode away from the bayou area and headed home. He returned to the house where his wife and children were going about their evening. He did not mention the ride along the trail. He did not say anything about what had just happened in the woods. To the people waiting for him, it looked like any other night. He had left for a bike ride and come back. Nothing out of the ordinary. But back at the Adleman home the situation had grown desperate. By 10 o'clock Mark had searched the route multiple times with no luck. The family could no longer wait. They picked up the phone and reported Nancy missing to the Houston police. Officers took the information and noted her usual jogging path along the bayou. Patrol cars began checking the area that same night. Flashlights cut through the darkness. Volunteers and family members joined in the search. They called her name into the trees. They walked every bend in the trail. The night stretched on with no answers. The Adleman family sat together in the living room, holding on to hope that this was all some terrible mistake, that Nancy would walk through the door any minute with a simple explanation. But deep down they knew something was wrong. The house stayed lit up all night. No one slept. The next morning, July 30th, the search continued with more officers and more urgency. The sun rose over Houston and the teams moved back along the bayou trails. With Arthur Lee Burton now in custody on August 8, 1997, the Houston Police Department moved quickly to lock down every piece of evidence that could tie him directly to the trail along Brays Bayou. Detectives wasted no time requesting search warrants from a Harris County judge. The first warrant covered Burton's residence in northwest Houston, the second targeted the bicycle he admitted riding that evening, and additional warrants allowed them to seize any clothing he had worn on July 29. Officers arrived at his home while his wife Felicia and the 4 children were still trying to process the fact that the man they knew as a steady provider was now sitting in an interrogation room downtown. The search teams went room by room, opening closets, checking drawers, bagging items that might carry trace evidence from the woods. They took the bicycle into custody and examined it for dirt, leaves, or any material that could match the ground where Nancy's body had been found. Every item was logged, photographed, and sent to the crime lab for testing. At the same time, the interrogation room became the center of the entire case. Deputy Sheriff Benjamin Beal sat across from Burton and started from the beginning. Burton looked calm at first. He told Beal he had never ridden his bicycle near the Bayou Trail that evening. He said he had no knowledge of Nancy Adleman and no idea why anyone would connect him to the crime. He gave a timeline of his day that placed him nowhere near the path where Nancy had jogged. Beal listened, took notes, and then began laying out the facts the department had already gathered. There was the witness who had seen a man on a bicycle standing near the Adleman house, agitated, watching the street. That same man had ridden off right after Nancy passed by on her way to the trail. Beal asked Burton to explain why his description matched the witness account so closely. Burton stuck to his story. The questions kept coming. Beal pointed out gaps in the timeline Burton had given. Where exactly had he ridden after work? Why did neighbors recall seeing him head toward the bayou area around the same time Nancy left her front door? Burton shifted in his chair. The inconsistencies piled up. After hours in that room, with the weight of the contradictions pressing down, Burton's account started to crack. He asked for a pen and paper and wrote out a full confession in his own handwriting. He admitted he had been riding the bicycle along the bayou when he saw Nancy jogging ahead of him. He described throwing the bike down, grabbing her from behind, and dragging her into the thick woods off the main path. He said he tried to assault her, that she fought hard and screamed, that he panicked when he thought someone might hear. He wrote that she looked at him and asked why he was doing it, told him he did not have to. Then he described choking her with his hands until she lost consciousness, seeing another person on the trail, and going back to finish the job with the lace from her own shoe. He signed the statement and handed it over. That written confession became the cornerstone of the entire investigation. It contained details only the person who had been in those woods could know, the exact words Nancy spoke during the struggle, the way he had concealed her body in the brush, the moment he decided to use the shoelace. Detectives knew they had something powerful, but they kept building. They executed the search warrants and collected every item that might support the confession. The bicycle was examined for any soil that matched the crime scene. Clothing from Burton's home was tested for fibers, dirt, or any transfer from the wooded area. The lab worked around the clock. While the physical searches continued, investigators turned to the people who knew Burton best. They sat down with his wife Felicia Batts. She told them her husband was a hard-working cement finisher who came home every day, helped with the children, and never showed any violence in the house. She said he treated her son from a previous relationship as his own and made sure the family had what it needed. She could not believe he was capable of the crime he had just confessed to. Burton's mother, Fanny Burton, gave a similar account. She described how her son had grown up with hardship but had tried to be the kind of father he never had. She said he liked to build things and spent his free time with the kids. His brother Michael added that Burton had worked hard to leave his teenage troubles behind. These interviews painted a picture of a family man that stood in sharp contrast to the details in the confession. Detectives listened carefully, took every statement, and noted how each family member stood by him even after the arrest. The forensic side of the investigation added more weight. The medical examiner's autopsy report came back with clear findings. Nancy Adleman had been beaten during the struggle, bruises covered her arms, legs, and torso from the fight she put up. Her clothing had been forcibly removed and left nearby. The cause of death was ligature strangulation using one of her own shoelaces, tied so tightly that it left deep marks. The examiner estimated the time of death matched the window when Burton said he had been on the trail. The report confirmed an attempted sexual assault, exactly as Burton had described in his written statement. Every detail lined up. Detectives cross-checked the autopsy with the crime scene photos and the evidence collected from the woods. The shoelace matched the sneakers Nancy had worn that evening. The location where her body had been concealed matched Burton's description of how he dragged her deeper into the brush. The witness who had seen the man on the bicycle identified Burton in a lineup. The pieces kept falling into place. But the investigation did not stop there. Officers returned to the Bayou Trail with Burton's confession in hand and walked the route he had described. They found the exact spot where he said he had thrown down the bicycle. They measured distances, timed how long it would take to drag someone into the woods, and confirmed that the timeline he gave fit perfectly with when Nancy had left her house and when her family started to worry. Every test, every measurement, every interview built the case higher. The family interviews added another layer. Felicia and Fanny Burton both sat for follow-up questions, repeating that the man they knew at home was not the man described in the confession. They talked about his daily routine, the way he provided for the children, the absence of any warning signs in their household. Detectives documented every word, knowing these statements would be heard in court. The contrast between the family's account and the physical evidence created a tension that would hang over the entire case for years. By the time the search warrants had been fully processed and the lab results reviewed, the Harris County District Attorney's Office had a file that included the eyewitness account, the written confession with its unique details, the autopsy findings, and the physical evidence from the scene. The investigation had taken 10 days to reach the arrest and another several weeks to lock down every supporting fact. The case against Arthur Lee Burton was solid, built step by step from the moment that witness came forward to the moment he signed his name on that confession paper. The evidence now sat ready for the courtroom, but Burton would later claim the confession had been coerced, setting up years of legal fights that would test every piece the investigators had gathered. The road from that interrogation room to the trial was about to begin, and what happened next would keep this case in the headlines for more than 2 decades. Stay with me, because the courtroom drama and the decades of appeals are coming up fast. The case against Arthur Lee Burton moved from the interrogation room to the courtroom faster than many in Houston expected. The trial opened in June 1998 inside the Harris County Courthouse in downtown Houston. The building was already a landmark for high-profile cases, with its tall columns and long hallways that echoed every footstep. By the first day of jury selection, the courtroom was packed. Reporters from local television stations and newspapers filled the back rows. Sketch artists set up their pads and pencils. Nancy Adleman's family sat together on one side, Mark Adleman holding Sarah's hand tightly, the 2 boys seated beside them with solemn faces. On the other side, Burton's wife Felicia and his mother Fanny attended every session, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and resolve. The air in the room felt heavy from the moment the judge called the proceedings to order. This was not just another case. It was the murder of a mother who had been taken during her evening jog, and the entire city was watching to see if justice would be served. Burton faced one count of capital murder. The specific charges laid out by the state were clear and carried the possibility of the death penalty. He was accused of murdering Nancy Adleman while in the course of kidnapping her and attempting to commit sexual assault. Under Texas law at the time, that combination made the crime eligible for capital punishment. The prosecution team from the Harris County District Attorney's Office made their strategy plain from the opening statements. They told the jury this was not a case built on guesswork. It rested on Burton's own written confession, on eyewitness testimony that placed him at the scene, and on forensic evidence that matched every detail he had provided. They made it clear they would ask the jury for a guilty verdict and, if that came, they would push hard for the death penalty in the punishment phase. The brutality of the attack, the fact that Nancy had fought back and spoken to her attacker, and the way her body had been left hidden in the brush all pointed to a crime that deserved the maximum sentence. The first major witness took the stand early in the trial. The neighbor who had been outside on July 29 described exactly what he saw. He told the jury he had noticed a man on a bicycle standing near the Adleman house. The man appeared agitated and gave off a mean expression when their eyes met. Not long after Nancy passed by on her way to the trail, the man rode off in the same direction. The witness pointed directly at Burton in the courtroom and said, "That is the man I saw that evening." The courtroom went completely still. Mark Adleman leaned forward in his seat. Sarah gripped her father's hand harder. The defense tried to shake the identification during cross-examination, asking about lighting and distance, but the witness held firm. He had seen Burton clearly enough to pick him out of a photo lineup days later and again in person. After that testimony, the jury had a direct link placing Burton at the starting point of Nancy's final jog. Next came Deputy Sheriff Benjamin Beal, the man who had conducted the interrogation. Beal walked the jury through the entire session step by step. He described how Burton first denied any involvement, how he gave a timeline that did not match the facts, and how the contradictions piled up until Burton asked for paper and wrote out his confession in his own handwriting. Beal read portions of that statement aloud in court. The words filled the room, Burton admitting he grabbed Nancy, dragged her into the woods, tried to assault her while she fought and screamed, and then used her own shoelace after she spoke to him. The jury listened intently as Beal explained that the confession contained details only the killer could have known, including the exact words Nancy said during the struggle. When the defense suggested the confession had been coerced, Beal stood his ground. He said Burton had been read his rights, had understood them, and had written the statement voluntarily after hours of questioning. The emotional weight of hearing those words read in open court hit the Adleman family hard. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. Mark stared straight ahead, jaw tight. The testimony ended with a clear picture of how the arrest had come together. But the defense promised their turn was coming, and the jury would hear a very different explanation for that confession. The medical examiner took the stand and turned the focus to the science. He described the autopsy in precise detail. Nancy Adleman had been beaten during a violent struggle. Bruises covered her arms, legs, and torso where she had fought back. Her clothing had been forcibly removed. The cause of death was ligature strangulation using one of her own shoelaces, tied with enough force to leave deep marks. The examiner estimated the time of death fell exactly within the window when Burton said he had been on the trail. He also confirmed the attempted sexual assault matched Burton's written account. When photographs from the crime scene and the autopsy were displayed on the screen, several jurors looked away. Mark Adleman lowered his head. Sarah covered her mouth with her hand. The images showed the wooded area where the body had been concealed and the marks that proved Nancy had not gone quietly. The examiner's calm, factual delivery made the horror even more real. The prosecution rested much of its case on this testimony, showing the jury that the physical evidence and the confession told the same story. The defense team rose for their turn. They argued that Burton's confession had been given under pressure and that he suffered from intellectual disability, meaning he had not fully understood his rights or the consequences of what he wrote. They brought in experts who testified about Burton's background, his difficult childhood, and test scores that they claimed showed limited mental capacity. They told the jury the confession was unreliable and that Burton had been a hard-working father who never showed violence at home. Felicia Batts and Fanny Burton both took the stand to describe the man they knew, the one who went to work every day and cared for his children. Their voices carried emotion as they asked the jury to see Burton as more than the words on that paper. The courtroom tension rose with every defense witness. The Adleman family listened quietly, their faces showing the strain of hearing Burton portrayed as the victim of the system. But the prosecution dismantled the defense claims one by one. They pointed out that Burton had given a detailed, coherent confession that matched the crime scene exactly. They highlighted his prior criminal record from age 18, the burglaries and drug involvement, showing he had made choices with full awareness in the past. They called rebuttal witnesses who testified that Burton had understood everything during the interrogation. The back and forth lasted days, each side presenting its version of who Arthur Lee Burton really was. After the final witnesses, the case went to the jury. They deliberated on the guilt phase and returned with a verdict that sent a ripple through the packed courtroom. But before the punishment phase could begin, the defense had one more argument about Burton's mental capacity that would stretch the legal battle far beyond that June day. The trial had delivered powerful testimony, graphic evidence, and emotional moments that left no one untouched. The jury had heard from the eyewitness, from the detective who took the confession, and from the medical examiner who laid out the cause of death. They had seen the contrast between the family man described by Burton's wife and mother and the man who had signed his name to a detailed admission of guilt. Yet the real test was still ahead. The punishment phase would decide whether Arthur Lee Burton would receive life in prison or the death penalty. The prosecution made it clear they wanted death. The defense fought to save his life. The courtroom drama was far from over, and what happened next in that Harris County courthouse would set the stage for 26 more years of appeals that reached all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Stay with me, because the verdict and the sentencing that followed changed everything for both families involved. The trial in Harris County Courthouse had lasted weeks. Every witness had spoken. Every piece of evidence had been shown. The jury had listened to the eyewitness place Burton near the Adleman house that evening, to Deputy Beale read the written confession aloud, to the medical examiner explain the strangulation with Nancy's own shoelace, to Burton's wife and mother describe the hard-working father they knew. The courtroom had filled with tension day after day as the two sides fought over what those facts really meant. On the final day of the guilt phase, the judge gave the jury their instructions and sent them to deliberate. The clock started ticking. The jurors filed into the deliberation room just after lunch on June 25, 1998. They had been given the full record, the confession that matched the crime scene details, the autopsy report confirming ligature strangulation and attempted sexual assault, the witness identification, the timeline that placed Burton on the trail at the exact moment Nancy disappeared. They reviewed the written statement Burton had signed, the one that included Nancy's final words to him, "Why are you doing this? You don't have to." They discussed the defense claim that the confession had been coerced and that Burton's background and test scores showed he could not have understood what he was doing. They weighed the testimony from Felicia and Fanny Burton against the physical evidence and the words Burton himself had written. Outside the deliberation room, the hallway stayed crowded. Reporters sat on benches with notepads ready. Nancy's family waited in a small side room, Mark holding Sarah's hand, the two boys sitting quietly between their father and an aunt. Burton's family occupied another corner of the courthouse, Felicia clutching a tissue, Fanny staring at the floor. The building hummed with low conversations, footsteps, the occasional door opening and closing. Everyone knew the verdict could come at any moment, yet hours passed with no word. The clock moved past 4 o'clock, then 5, then 6. The tension built with every minute. Mark kept looking at his watch. Sarah whispered questions to her father about what might happen if the jury came back quickly. No one had answers that felt certain. Inside the room the jurors continued their discussion. They went over the elements of capital murder again and again. The state had charged Burton with murder during the commission of kidnapping and attempted sexual assault. They examined whether the evidence proved each part beyond a reasonable doubt. They talked about the confession's detail, how it described dragging Nancy off the trail, the struggle in the woods, the use of the shoelace after another person appeared nearby. They considered the defense argument about intellectual disability but noted that Burton had given a coherent, detailed account that aligned perfectly with the forensic findings. They voted. They discussed. They voted again. Just before 7 o'clock that evening, the jury sent word they had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters rushed to their seats. The Adleman family returned to their bench, faces tight with anticipation. Burton's family filed in on the other side. Burton himself was brought back in, handcuffed, wearing the same orange jumpsuit he had worn throughout the trial. He sat beside his attorneys, eyes forward. The judge entered. The bailiff called the courtroom to order. The jury filed in and took their seats. The foreperson stood when asked if they had reached a unanimous verdict. They had. The judge asked the foreperson to read the verdict. The room went completely silent. The foreperson's voice carried clearly through the microphone. We the jury find the defendant, Arthur Lee Burton, guilty of the offense of capital murder as charged in the indictment. A gasp ran through the courtroom. Mark Adleman closed his eyes for a moment, shoulders dropping as if a weight had finally lifted partway. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands. The two boys looked at their father, unsure what the words fully meant but feeling the shift in the air. On the other side Felicia let out a small cry and buried her face in her hands. Fanny reached over and held her daughter-in-law's arm. Burton showed no visible reaction, he sat still, looking straight ahead. The judge thanked the jury and told them they would return the next day for the punishment phase. Court adjourned. The next morning the punishment phase began. The prosecution called witnesses to show why death was the appropriate sentence. They brought back the medical examiner to repeat the brutality of the attack, how Nancy had fought, how she had been strangled after resisting. They presented victim impact testimony from Mark, who spoke quietly about the empty chair at the dinner table, the plays Nancy would never finish writing, the grandchildren she would never meet. Sarah took the stand and described the moment officers came to the door to tell them her mother was gone, how the house had never felt the same since. The boys were too young to testify, but their presence in the courtroom spoke for itself. The state argued that Burton had shown no remorse in the years since the crime, that he had chosen to take a life during a violent act, and that society needed protection from someone capable of such an offense. The defense fought back hard. They called experts who testified about Burton's childhood hardships, his limited intellectual functioning, and how those factors had shaped his decisions. They brought family members again. Felicia described the father who read to the children every night, Fanny spoke of the son who had tried to break the cycle of absence he had known. They asked the jury to consider life without parole instead of death, arguing that Burton could be contained safely in prison for the rest of his life. The arguments went back and forth for 2 full days. The jury listened, took notes, asked questions through the judge. On June 29, 1998, the jury returned to deliberate the punishment. They did not take long. After less than 4 hours they sent word they had reached a decision. The courtroom filled once more. The same tension gripped everyone. The foreperson stood again. The judge asked for the verdict on punishment. The foreperson read it clearly: "We the jury unanimously find that there is a probability that the defendant would commit criminal acts of violence that would constitute a continuing threat to society, and we answer the special issue in the affirmative." They also found no sufficient mitigating circumstances to warrant life instead of death. The judge polled the jury to confirm unanimity. Each juror answered yes. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs from both sides. Mark Adleman put his arm around Sarah. Felicia collapsed against Fanny. Burton remained still, head bowed slightly for the first time. The judge formally pronounced the sentence: Arthur Lee Burton was to be put to death by lethal injection. Court adjourned. Officers led Burton out of the room. As he passed the Adleman family, Mark looked directly at him, no words, just a long, steady gaze. Burton did not look back. That same afternoon Burton was transferred from the Harris County Jail to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He was taken by van to the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, the state's primary death row facility for men at that time. The drive took several hours. He arrived in the late afternoon, was processed through intake, given his prison number, and assigned to a cell on death row. The unit was known for its strict security, single cells, limited contact, constant supervision. Burton stepped into that world on June 29, 1998, at age 28. He would spend the next 26 years there, filing appeals, waiting for decisions from higher courts, including 2 trips to the United States Supreme Court, while the Adleman family continued living with the loss that had started on a summer evening jog. The sentence had been delivered. The courtroom had emptied. But the legal fight was far from finished. Burton's attorneys immediately began the appeals process, challenging the confession, the intellectual disability claim, and every step of the trial. Those appeals would stretch on for decades, keeping the case alive in headlines and court filings long after the jury had spoken. The arrival on death row marked the start of a long wait, one that would end only on August 7, 2024, when Burton took his final breath in the Huntsville execution chamber. The verdict and sentence closed one chapter, but the story of what happened next, through every appeal, every stay, every argument that reached the highest court in the land, is still ahead. Stay with me, because the decades on death row and the final execution are coming up next. Arthur Lee Burton arrived at the Polunsky Unit in Livingston, Texas, on the afternoon of June 29, 1998, and stepped into the only home he would know for the rest of his life. The Polunsky Unit is the state of Texas's designated facility for male death row inmates, a massive concrete complex surrounded by layers of fencing and watchtowers. Burton received his official prison number, 999283, and was walked down a long corridor to one of the death row pods. His new cell measured just 60 square feet, a concrete box with a steel bunk bolted to the wall, a metal desk and stool, a combined toilet and sink, and barely enough floor space to take 3 steps in any direction. The door was solid steel with a narrow food slot and a small observation window. From that moment forward, every day followed the same rigid schedule that never changed for 26 years. At 3 o'clock every morning the lights snapped on across the entire pod. Officers conducted the first head count. Breakfast trays slid through the slot in the door. Burton ate alone, sitting on the edge of his bunk. Showers were allowed 3 times a week. An officer would cuff him through the slot, walk him to a small shower stall while the rest of the pod remained locked down, then return him to his cell. He spent 23 hours a day inside those 4 walls. The 1 hour of recreation took place in a chain-link cage attached to the building, barely larger than his cell, where he could walk in circles or do push-ups under the sky but never speak face-to-face with another human being. Meals arrived 3 times a day through the slot. Mail was inspected and passed in. Approved phone calls were rare and happened on a corded phone passed from cell to cell on a long pole. Family visits occurred behind thick glass, voices carried through telephones bolted to the wall, no touching allowed. Books, legal papers, and a small radio were the only possessions he could keep. The routine never varied. The walls never changed color. The sounds were always the same: distant shouts from other cells, the clank of keys, the steady hum of the ventilation system. Burton filled those endless hours with the only thing left to him, the appeals process. His lawyers filed motion after motion, arguing that his confession had been coerced, that his childhood hardships and test scores proved intellectual disability, and that the death sentence should be set aside. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed every claim in detail. Federal judges examined the record again and again. The case traveled up and down the court system, sometimes coming within hours of an execution date before a last-minute stay arrived. Each denial sent Burton back to the same cell to wait for the next round of paperwork. His family made the long drive from Houston whenever they could afford the gas and the time. Felicia and Fanny sat across the glass, telling him about the children who were now grown, about the grandchildren he had never held. The kids grew up visiting the prison, learning to talk to their grandfather through a telephone while staring at the man behind the glass. Burton wrote letters back, trying to stay part of their lives from inside the concrete box. Meanwhile, the Adleman family followed every court filing from the other side of the state. Mark and Sarah attended hearings whenever possible, sitting quietly while lawyers argued over the same confession the jury had already accepted. They marked time by the milestones Nancy would never see: birthdays, graduations, weddings, the plays she would never finish. The case stayed alive in Houston news reports every time a new appeal was filed or rejected. People who had never met Nancy still remembered the story of the mother taken off the Bayou Trail, the playwright whose own shoelace had been used against her. The details refused to fade: the witness on the bicycle, the words Nancy spoke during the struggle, the written confession that matched the crime scene exactly. Those facts kept the case talked about year after year, long after most 1997 crimes had slipped from memory. The years piled up. Burton turned 30, then 40, then 50 inside the same cell. His hair grayed. His children became parents. The grandchildren asked questions about the grandfather they only knew from prison visits. Burton stayed in touch with other men on the pod by shouting through the vents or passing notes when officers allowed. Some inmates found religion and spent their days reading the Bible. Others studied law books and helped each other with paperwork. Burton did what he could to keep his mind sharp while the legal clock kept moving. By the summer of 2024 he had spent more than half his life on death row. He was 54 years old. The case had outlasted multiple governors, district attorneys, and judges. The final round of appeals came in 2024. His lawyers filed new claims based on updated evaluations of his intellectual capacity. The Texas courts rejected them. The United States Supreme Court reviewed the petition and, on the morning of August 7, 2024, denied the stay of execution. The date that had been set would move forward that same evening. Prison officials transferred Burton from Pulaski to the Huntsville Unit, the historic red brick penitentiary where Texas carries out every execution. He spent his last hours in a holding cell near the execution chamber. Texas no longer offers special last meals, so Burton received the standard prison dinner tray. He met with his spiritual advisor and spoke with his brother Michael through the glass. At 6 o'clock that evening the witnesses entered the viewing rooms. Mark Adleman and Sarah sat on one side with other family members. Burton's brother sat on the opposite side. At 6:47 p.m. the lethal injection process began. Burton lay on the gurney, straps across his body. He looked through the window and gave his final statement. He thanked everyone who had supported him and prayed for him. He told his brother and the other men on death row that he loved them. Then he said the words that would be quoted across the country, "Bird is going home." He turned toward the Adleman family's side and added, "To all the people I have hurt and caused pain, I wish we didn't have to be here at this moment, but I want you to know that I am sorry for putting y'all through this and my family." His voice caught as he spoke. He nodded once more toward his brother. The drugs took effect. He took 4 deep breaths and then lay still. The time of death was pronounced at 6:47 p.m. The long road that started with a bicycle ride along Brays Bayou on July 29, 1997, had finally reached its end in a small room in Huntsville. The Adleman family drove home that night carrying 27 years of memories and loss that no verdict or execution could erase. Burton's family left the prison knowing the man they had defended for decades was gone. The case that had filled courtrooms and newspapers for nearly 3 decades now belonged to the history books. Yet the story of what happened on that trail, the confession, the appeals, and the final words spoken in the execution chamber still surfaces every time someone in Houston laces up running shoes and heads toward the bayou paths. The chapter on death row closed that night at 6:47 p.m., but the questions it left behind about justice, memory, and the price of waiting remain with both families and with anyone who has followed the case from the beginning. Stay with me, because the lasting impact on everyone touched by this story and the thoughts that still linger are coming up next. The lethal injection process ended at exactly 6:47 p.m. on August 7, 2024, inside the Huntsville unit. Arthur Lee Burton had spoken his final words and the state of Texas had carried out the sentence the jury delivered back in 1998. For the Adleman family, the moment that had taken 27 years to reach had finally arrived. Mark Adleman, Nancy's husband, sat in the witness room with their son Jeffrey and Nancy's brother Robert Buquoy. They watched through the glass as the procedure concluded. Mark's current wife Herlinda Wilkinson was also present. None of them made any public statement afterward. They left the prison quietly and returned to their lives in Houston. The legal battle that had stretched from the night Nancy failed to return from her jog was over, but the personal journey for every member of the family continued in its own way. Mark Adleman had been the one who called the police that Tuesday evening in 1997 when Nancy did not come home from the Brays Bayou Trail. He had driven the route himself searching for her. He had identified her body the next day after search teams found her concealed in the woods. In the decades that followed, he raised their 3 children while working through the grief that never fully lifted. Friends who knew the couple before the murder have said Mark was never the same man after that night. The house that once filled with Nancy's poetry readings and rehearsals for her plays grew quieter. He attended every court hearing and every appeal hearing across the years, sitting through arguments about the confession, the eyewitness account, and the details of how Nancy had fought back on that trail. Mark remarried years later to Herlinda Wilkinson, who stood beside him through the final appeals and the execution itself. He has spoken little publicly about the loss, but those close to the family describe a man who carried the weight of that July evening every single day. The grandchildren Nancy never met grew up hearing stories about their grandmother, the playwright and mother who went out for an ordinary jog and never returned. Their daughter Sarah was 16 years old when her mother disappeared. She had waited by the phone that night, hoping for any word. She had been there when officers came to the door the next morning with the news no child should ever hear. Sarah grew up in the shadow of that loss. She turned to writing and helping others as a way to process what had happened. In 2019 she published a memoir called The Lampblack Blue of Memory, My Mother's Echoes. The book includes some of Nancy's original poetry and Sarah's reflections on learning to live without the mother who had encouraged her creativity from an early age. Sarah later moved to the Denver area where she works as a yoga therapist, specializing in helping survivors of traumatic brain injuries find strength and healing. When the execution date approached in 2024, Sarah made a deliberate choice. She decided not to travel to Huntsville. Instead of sitting in the witness room, she organized a private gratitude and forgiveness ceremony at a local river with her own son and a small group of family friends. She wanted to honor Nancy by focusing on joy and the positive memories rather than the final moments on the gurney. Sarah has spoken in interviews about writing a letter to Burton years earlier while he was still on death row. She told him she hoped he could find peace and that she was open to any information he might share while he was alive. At 43 years old, Sarah continues to keep her mother's voice alive through the pages of her book and through the work she does with people who are rebuilding their lives after trauma. She has emphasized choosing joy every day and creating the life she wants rather than letting the events of 1997 define everything. The two sons took their own paths through the years of grief. Jeffrey, one of the boys who had been younger at the time of the murder, chose to attend the execution with his father Mark. He sat in that witness room and watched as the sentence was carried out more than 27 years after he lost his mother. The other son has remained more private about his experiences. Both sons grew up without the mother who used to read her latest play lines at the dinner table and who balanced theater work with raising 3 children. They became adults in a home where Nancy's absence remained a constant presence. Birthdays passed without her. School events and graduations happened without her proud smile in the crowd. They built their own families while carrying the memory of a mother taken during what should have been a routine evening jog. Friends and members of Houston's theater community kept Nancy's creative legacy alive in their own ways. Nancy had moved to Houston in the late 1970s after earning her theater degree and her Master of Fine Arts. She wrote poetry from the time she was 11 years old and turned those words into plays performed on local stages. After her death, some of those who had worked with her dedicated productions to her memory. Writers who knew her spoke about the talent that ended too soon on that wooded stretch of the Bayou Trail. The case itself became one of the most remembered crimes in Houston from the 1990s. Local news outlets revisited the story every time a new appeal was filed or denied. When the execution date was finally set for August 2024, the coverage returned in full force. Reporters recounted the details again: the witness who saw the man on the bicycle near the Adleman house, the confession Burton wrote out by hand, the words Nancy spoke to him during the struggle, and the way her body had been concealed in the brush. People across the city who had never met Nancy still remembered the story of the mother of 3 taken right off a path she had used for years without any trouble. The Bayou trails Nancy once jogged remain open today. Runners still use them in the evenings. But for those who remember July 29, 1997, those paths carry a different meaning. Neighbors who lived near the Adleman home at the time have said the murder changed how they thought about safety in the area. People started jogging in groups or carrying whistles. Parents warned their children about going out alone. The image of a woman lacing up her sneakers for what should have been an ordinary exercise routine and then never coming home left a lasting impression on Northwest Houston. The crime scene details, the struggle that left bruises across Nancy's body, the use of her own shoelace to end her life, and the fact that she had spoken directly to Burton in those final moments all stayed with anyone who followed the case through the decades of court proceedings. The Adleman family now moves forward knowing the legal process has reached its conclusion. Mark continues his quiet life with Herlinda. Sarah builds her career around healing and gratitude while raising her son and keeping her mother's poetry alive in print. The sons raise their own families and carry the memories in their own ways. They have chosen different paths to honor Nancy, some through private remembrance, others through published words, and all through the simple decision to keep living each day. The trail along Brays Bayou still exists. People still jog there in the Texas heat. But for the family and for everyone who remembers the events of that summer evening, the path will always hold the echo of what happened in the woods beside it. The story that started with a routine evening jog and ended with a final statement in the execution chamber leaves behind more than a closed legal file. It leaves behind a family forever changed by the loss of a mother, wife, and playwright whose own words and strength continue to inspire those who knew her. The brutality of what occurred on that trail, the fight Nancy put up, the words she spoke to the man who took her life, and the way one ordinary Tuesday evening permanently altered so many futures still lingers with anyone who hears the full account. The echoes of Nancy Adleman's voice, preserved in her poetry and in the lives she touched, continue long after the gurney was wheeled away and the chamber lights went dark. The story of Nancy Adleman and Arthur Lee Burton began on an ordinary Tuesday evening in Houston when a mother of three laced up her sneakers for a jog she had taken countless times before. It ended on August 7, 2024, at 6:47 p.m. inside the Huntsville unit when the state carried out the sentence that had been handed down more than a quarter century earlier. From the moment Burton threw down his bicycle on the trail near Brays Bayou, grabbed Nancy from behind, and dragged her into those woods, every detail that followed built a chain of events that no one in the Adleman family or in the city of Houston could have imagined would stretch across 27 full years. The struggle in the brush, the screams that went unanswered, the words Nancy spoke directly to him asking why he was doing it and telling him he did not have to, the shoelace taken from her own shoe, the body concealed in the undergrowth, the witness who saw the agitated man on the bicycle near her house, the 10-day search that ended with the discovery, the interrogation where Burton first denied everything and then wrote out his confession in his own handwriting, the trial in the packed Harris County Courthouse where the jury heard every graphic detail from the autopsy and saw the crime scene photos, the guilty verdict on capital murder charges for killing during kidnapping and attempted sexual assault, the punishment phase where the family stood up and described the empty chair at the dinner table and the plays that would never be finished, the death sentence pronounced on June 29, 1998, the transfer to the Polunsky unit where Burton lived in a 60-square-foot cell for 23 hours a day with only 1 hour of recreation in a cage and visits behind glass, the endless appeals that reached the United States Supreme Court twice, the family drives from Houston to Livingston for phone conversations through a bolted receiver, the grandchildren who grew up knowing their grandfather only through prison visits, the way the case stayed alive in local news every time a new motion was filed or denied, and finally the transfer to Huntsville on that last day when the Supreme Court refused the stay and the execution moved forward at the exact scheduled time. This was never a crime of sudden rage or an unplanned moment that got out of hand. Burton had time to see Nancy jogging ahead on the path, time to throw down the bicycle, time to chase her into the trees, time to react when she fought back and screamed, time to go back after seeing another person nearby and finish what he had started with the lace from her shoe. The written confession he signed captured every step with details only the person who had been there could know. The jury saw that truth clearly in 1998. The courts upheld it through every legal challenge for the next 26 years. And on that August evening in 2024 the long road that started with a routine jog and a bicycle ride finally reached the room where Burton lay on the gurney, looked through the window toward the witnesses, thanked those who had prayed for him, told the other men on death row that he loved them, said the phrase that would be repeated in every news report, and then turned toward the Adleman family's side and offered the only apology he ever gave in public. The drugs took effect, for deep breaths followed, and at 6:47 p.m. the chapter that had consumed two families and an entire city for more than half a lifetime came to its legal end. Yet the echoes of that Tuesday evening refused to fade. The bayou trails Nancy once ran still wind through northwest Houston. People still lace up their shoes in the evenings and head out for exercise, but many who remember the case pause a little longer when they pass the spot where the woods meet the path. Runners who were children in 1997 now bring their own kids to the same area and tell them the story in quiet voices. The theater community that once watched Nancy's plays performed on local stages still dedicates productions to her memory and keeps copies of her poetry on display. Mark Adleman rebuilt a life with his second wife Herlinda, attending every hearing across the decades and sitting in the witness room on the final night. Sarah, the 16-year-old who waited by the phone that night, grew into a woman who wrote a memoir titled The Lampblack Blue of Memory, sharing her mother's words and her own journey of choosing joy every day. She held a private ceremony by a river instead of traveling to Huntsville, focusing on gratitude and healing rather than the gurney. The two sons raised their own families while carrying the absence of the mother who used to read her latest lines at the dinner table. The grandchildren who never met Nancy learned about the playwright and mother through stories, photos, and the book that keeps her voice alive. The legal system moved at its own deliberate pace, testing every piece of evidence, every appeal, every claim about the confession and Burton's background, until the courts finally said the sentence would stand. Burton spent more than half his life in that 60-square-foot cell, waking to lights at 3 in the morning, eating alone, showering 3 times a week under escort, pacing in a cage for 1 hour a day, and waiting for mail or a phone call that might bring news of another court date. His wife Felicia and mother Fanny made the long drives for years, sitting across the glass and updating him on children who became adults and grandchildren he never held. The contrast between the family man they described and the man who signed the confession that matched the crime scene in every detail kept the case alive in conversations across Texas for decades. Now the gurney has been wheeled away, the chamber lights have gone dark, and both families must find their way forward in a world that no longer includes court dates or execution dates. The Adleman family carries the strength Nancy showed in those woods, the same strength that let her fight back and speak directly to the man who took her life. The Burton family carries the weight of the choices made on that trail and the years spent hoping for a different outcome. The city of Houston carries the memory of a crime that changed how people thought about safety on familiar paths. And anyone who has followed this story from the first missing person report to the final statement at 6:47 p.m. carries the knowledge that one ordinary evening jog can set in motion a chain of events that lasts longer than most lifetimes. What do you think about how this case finally ended after 27 years? Do you believe the death penalty was the right outcome for a crime that took a mother from her children during a routine jog, or would life without parole have been enough? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. If this story bruised your soul the way it did mine, like this video, subscribe to Bruised Voice, and turn on all notifications. Drop your thoughts, and your country, in the comments. Until the next case leaves its mark, stay bruised.